It was 11 o'clock at night, and there were 4 people left in the building, and I was the only one of them who mattered, because I was the one about to make the mistake. My name is Thea Halloran. I was 27 and Omega, and the second taster at Ondine Kestrel. 140 years of tea in a brick warehouse on the North Wharf, and me, on the top floor of it, with a brass spoon and a row of white cups. We were migrating the whole company onto a new system that week. Everything anyone had ever saved on the old drives had to be moved by hand into the right folder, and the folders had names like Harvest-Q3 and Lots-Inbound and Review-CEO, and I had been at it since 7 in the morning with a cold cup at my elbow.
Welcome, everyone! Don't forget to subscribe to the channel!
I had one file on that machine that was not the company's. It was mine. It was a spreadsheet I had kept for 6 years. The only place in the world where the truth about my body was written down in full. The dose dates, the 4 windows a year when my palate goes to ruin and I cannot be trusted at a cupping table, the unpaid leave I took for them, my doctor's initials in the margin. I had named it HS-Q3 because I am a coward, and because HS is 2 letters that could mean anything, and because if you cannot say a thing out loud, you at least learn to abbreviate it. Harvest-Q3. HS-Q3. 4 letters apart. At 11:04 at night, I dragged the wrong one into Review-CEO, and I did not notice. And I went to wash my cups. The reply came at 11:06. 2 minutes. I was standing at the sink with my hands in warm water when my phone lit on the steel drainer, and it was from Vesper Kestrel, who in 11 years had never once messaged me after hours, and it was 6 words long. I cleared those days 2 years ago. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up first. I did not learn tea from a company. I learned it from my grandmother, in a room over a chandler's shop with the window open to the water, and I learned it the way you learn a language before you know. That is what it is. Ivy Halloran carried chests off the wharf for 11 years before anyone let her taste anything. That was the order of things then. Women carried, men graded, and the ones who graded stood in a warm room in clean coats and spat into a brass bowl and decided what a year's work on the other side of the world was worth. My grandmother carried. She had a back like a door and a mouth like a closed drawer, and every day for 11 years, she set down her chest at the door of the cupping room and stood in the doorway 1 second longer than she needed to, breathing. That was how she learned, in a doorway, on other people's time, out of the air. And when the head grader at number 4 warehouse dropped dead of his heart in the spring of 1968, and there was a room full of unjudged lots and a ship waiting, my grandmother took off her carrying belt, walked to the table she had never been invited to, tasted 9 cups in a row, and put them in an order that a buyer from Hamburg paid the full asking price for that same afternoon. They gave her the job because there was nobody else. They kept giving it to her for 31 years because there was nobody better. She taught me on the floor of that room over the chandlers, with the cups set out on a folded towel. Not the names. The names come free, she said. Anyone can learn a name. She taught me the thing under the names, which is that everything that has ever happened to a leaf is still in it, where it grew, how wet the spring was, whether the hands that picked it were tired, and above all, how hot it got, and how fast, and how long, because heat is the thing that cannot be taken back out. You can hide a bad leaf under a good roast for about 4 seconds, she said. Then the water tells on you. Heat leaves a record, she used to say. It is in everything it ever touched. She left me 2 things. The first was a brass tasting spoon, deep bowled, the old kind, worn thin along one side of the rim because she was left-handed and had drawn it across her lower lip about 1,000,000 times. The second was a copper thermometer with a cracked face that had stopped working in 1974. I asked her once why she still hung it over the table if it was dead. She said, "I do not need it to tell me anything. I need it to keep me honest." Then she said, "When you are sure, check anyway." That was the whole of her philosophy, and I have never improved on it. I went to work for Ondine Kestrel at 19 because they were the last house on that stretch of water still cupping their own lots. And because my grandmother had spent 31 years 200 meters from their door and had never been asked inside it. I started in packing, 14-kilo cases, 9 hours, brown paper cuts on both thumbs. That was the deal I made with myself. I would come in the way she came in, from the bottom, through the goods door, and I would stand in doorways until somebody made the mistake of letting me taste something. That took 4 years. It might have taken 40. What it actually took was one wet Tuesday in November. When the head taster had flu, the second taster was in Colombo. A container of first flush had come in off a delayed ship with a temperature exception on the log, and there was nobody in the building qualified to say whether 11,000 kilos of it was ruined. I was 23, and I was in packing, and I put my hand up. I will tell you exactly what I said, because it is the only brave sentence of my life, and I have earned the right to repeat it. I said, the reefer failed on the 12th for somewhere between 6 and 9 hours. It did not go above 31 degrees, and I can tell you within 1 cup which side of the pallet was against the wall. And a man from insurance laughed at me. And a woman standing at the back of the room by the freight door, in a charcoal coat, who I had seen perhaps 5 times in 4 years and had never once heard speak, said, "Give her the cups." That was Vesper Kestrel, and I want to be very careful here, because you have already decided what kind of story this is, and you are going to be wrong about the shape of it for a long time, exactly the way I was. She was 34 then, an alpha, the 4th Kestrel to run the house, and by a distance the coldest thing anyone on that wharf had ever worked for. Jet black hair she cut herself, twice a year, badly. Gray eyes with no give in them. She wore charcoal every day of her life the way other people wear a uniform, which is to say as a way of not being looked at. The trade called her cold water. It was not affectionate. It came from a story about her walking a Dutch buyer through the warehouse in February with no coat on and never once shivering, and the buyer signing for a year's contract simply to get back into a warm car. I got 11 cups. I got them wrong side up on a bench in front of 9 people who wanted me to fail so the afternoon could go back to normal. I found the wall side of the pallet in cup 4. I put the whole 11,000 kilos in a grade that was 2 down from clean, but well above ruined. And the reinspection 3 days later came back 1/2 grade off what I had said, which for a 23-year-old out of packing is the same as being right. Vesper Kestrel did not congratulate me. She never has, not once, not to this day, not in the way people mean it. What she did was walk out of the room while the reinspection was still being read aloud, and by the end of that week, there was a locker with my name on it on the top floor, and a white coat in it, and a bench at the far end of the cupping table under the north window, and nobody in the building would tell me who had signed for any of it. That was 8 years ago. I want you to hold on to the shape of that, because it is the shape of the whole thing. She gives, and she leaves the room before you can look at her while you take it. Here is what my life was for those 8 years. I was up at 5. The cupping room at number 4 faces north because you want flat light on the leaf. And in winter, it is so cold your hands ache on the kettle. And in August, it is a glass house, and you drink 4 liters of water and taste anyway. 60 cups a morning. You take the liquor into your mouth with the spoon at speed, hard, so it sprays across the whole palate, and you hold it 4 seconds, and you spit, and you say a sentence about it that a stranger on another continent will trust with 100,000 pounds. 60 times. Then you do the afternoon. And 4 times a year, for 4 days at a stretch, I could not do any of it. I'm not going to dress that up. I am an omega, and my cycle takes my palate away from me before it takes anything else. 2 days out, everything goes sweet. Sugar where there is no sugar, honey in a plain green, a roast reading as caramel when it is actually scorched. It is the cruelest possible symptom for the only thing I am good at, and there is no medication that fixes it. And the first time it happened at the table, I graded a 15-kilo sample of a Nilgiri 2 full grades high, and a buyer in Bremen very nearly paid for it. So I built the spreadsheet, 6 years of it. Dates, doses, the 2-day fade in and the 2-day fade out, the exact hour my mouth came back to me. I logged it the way I logged a lot, because it was the only way I could take a thing that felt like a betrayal by my own body and turn it into data, and data I can work with. And I told no one at that company. Not one person. Because I had watched what happened to Marguerite Vaz in blending, who put omega on a medical form in 2019 and was moved to compliance inside a year and told it was a promotion. What I did instead was lie in small ways. I took the 4 windows as unpaid leave. I said it was my mother's hip, my flat's boiler, a dentist, a funeral for an aunt I do not have. I built up a small, ugly ledger of little lies 4 times a year for 6 years, and I carried it around with me the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket. And I told myself that the cost of it was the price of the bench under the north window. And it worked. That is the part I need you to understand before anything else. For 6 years, it worked flawlessly, and no one ever asked, and no one ever queried the leave, and it never once fell on a cupping day. And the roster never once put me on the table in one of those windows. And I thought, because I was young and because I am arrogant about the wrong things, I thought that was me being careful. Now, the other thing that was true in that building, which I could not have explained to you then, Vesper Kestrel would not come near me. Not in the way you are thinking. She was in that cupping room most mornings. She started at 5 like the rest of us. There was no part of that house she did not walk through. But there was a distance she kept, and it was exact. And after about a year of it, I began to measure it, the way you measure anything you cannot ask about. 4 feet. She came to the far side of the cupping table and no further. If I was on the north side, she took the south. If a sample had to pass between us, it went to Ada. And Ada handed it on. In 8 years, in a building where I saw her 300 days a year, Vesper Kestrel and I had touched exactly twice. And both times, it was a hand on a door frame we had both reached at once. And both times, she took hers away first. The rest of the floor thought she disliked me. Priya, who I shared a flat with and who ran the packing line I had come up from, thought it was funnier than that. Priya thought the cold water was frightened of the girl from packing who could out-taste her. And Priya said so, at volume, most Fridays. And I let them think it. Because the alternative was to sit with the other thing I had noticed and could not put anywhere, which was that in 8 years I had never once heard that woman say my surname without a fractional pause in front of it, as though she had to go and fetch it from somewhere further off than other people's names. Ada Pike is the one who told me. Not then, much later. Ada is 71 and has been foreman of number 4 since before I was born, and she carried chess alongside my grandmother for 2 years in the 80s, and calls me Ivy's girl to this day, which she thinks is an insult, and I have never corrected. Ada said, near the end of all this, in the doorway of the drying loft with her cap in her hands, "You never wondered why the roster was so kind to you, love. But I am ahead of myself. Back to the perimeter. Here's what a workday actually looked like inside 4 feet of Vesper Kestrel. She came in at 5:10 with the same steel flask she had carried for a decade. She stood at the south end. She did not taste. That is the thing nobody outside the trade believes. The woman who ran one of the last houses in the country, still cupping its own lots, never put a spoon in her mouth in front of another human being. She listened to the kettle instead. She had a trick. A horrible, beautiful trick her mother had beaten into her before she was 12, where she could tell you the temperature of water inside 4 degrees by the sound it made coming to the boil. And she would stand there with her thumb pressed flat to the inside of her own wrist, counting the seconds of a steep against her own pulse. Because Ondine Kestrel had taken every clock out of the cupping room in 1996 and told her daughter that a Kestrel who needed a clock was a Kestrel who could be replaced. I watched her do that for 8 years, and I thought it was arrogance. It took me most of a decade to understand I was watching somebody being obedient to a dead instruction. Ondine Kestrel is 66 and she is not dead, which is worse. She stepped back from running the house 11 years ago and took the chair of the board instead, which in that family meant she stopped doing the work and kept all of the power. She came to the wharf 4 times a year. She wore pale gray. She had her daughter's gray eyes with about 40 more years of use on them. And she had a way of standing in the cupping room with her hands folded, looking at the north window, saying nothing. that could empty that floor of every person in it inside 10 minutes. And 2.5 years before the night I sent the wrong file, Ondine Kestrel began the process of selling us. Not outright. Nothing that woman does is outright. It came to us as a partnership, then as an investment, then as a structure. And by the spring, it had a name, Blythe and Vain, a group out of the South with 11 brands and a very good logistics arm, and not one single person on the payroll who could grade a lot. Their principal was an alpha called Corisande Blythe, 41, who wore beautiful coats and shook hands like she was checking the weight of you, and who had said, at her first walkthrough of number 4, standing in the middle of my cupping room, that the tasting was charming, and that she assumed we would be moving to instrumented analysis within 18 months. Charming. She stood under my grandmother's dead thermometer, which I had hung over the north end of the table my first week, and she called the last cupping room on that wharf charming. And Vesper Kestrel, who had not raised her voice in my hearing in 8 years, said nothing at all. She looked at the floor for 4 seconds. Then she said, "We will discuss it upstairs," and took them up. And I stood there with 60 cups going cold in front of me and hated her with a completeness that frightened me. I did not know then what she was holding. Here's what she was holding, and I am going to tell you now rather than at the end, because you deserve to be further along than I was. Ondine Kestrel controlled the trust that held the family's voting shares. Vesper ran the company, but did not own the right to keep running it. And there was a clause in that trust, put there by Ondine in the year her daughter turned 30, which said that on the day Vesper Kestrel bonded, the voting block moved to her if the bond was with a party approved in writing by the chair, and away from her permanently if it was not. Her own mother had put a price on who her daughter was allowed to love and set it at the whole company. So, the perimeter, 4 feet, 8 years. Now you know what the 4 feet cost, and I did not, and that is the gap I lived in for most of my 20s. The last thing I need you to have before the night of the file is the roster. Marrow and Kestrel ran on a paper roster until 2 years before all this and then moved to a system. And in that system, every taster had a set of blocked windows, training, holiday, sample trips, the annual medical. Mine had 4 blocks a year in it that I had never put there. 4 days each. They were marked with an operational code, PM4, which stands for plant maintenance, and they were attached to the north window bench. And if you look them up, they said the bench was out of service for calibration. They fell every single time. On the 4 days a year my palette is gone. I never looked. That is the thing I have had to sit with. I had 6 years of my own data in a spreadsheet, and I never once cross-checked it against the roster, because the roster being kind to me was the one thing in my life I did not want to examine, in case examining it made it stop. Now, the night. It was a Thursday in the last week of September, which in a tea house is the worst week of the year. The autumn lots land, the harvest cupping is 11 days out, and everybody is doing 2 jobs. The migration was the 3rd job. They had given us a fortnight to move 11 years of files by hand, and we were on day 9, and the floor was down to 4 people. Me, Priya, doing the packing archive 2 floors below, a contractor from the systems firm asleep in a chair in the lift lobby, and Ada Pike, who does not leave that building before midnight in September, and never has. The trouble with moving files at 11 at night is that it is not difficult. That is what does it. Nothing that is difficult ever gets you. You are awake for the difficult things. It was 2 panes on a screen, a list on the left and a list on the right, and I had done it 400 times that week. And my hands knew it well enough that my head had gone somewhere else entirely. Harvest Q3 sat in my working folder. HSQ3 sat 2 rows above it because the machine sorts alphabetically and does not care what it is sorting. And on the right-hand pane, top of the list, in bold, because it was the folder everything had to be checked into that week, was Review. I clicked, I dragged, the bar filled. I closed the window, and I picked up my cups and took them to the sink at the end of the room where the tap runs warm at night because the pipe passes the boiler, and I stood there for 120 seconds washing 4 cups. My phone was on the steel drainer. It lit. I want to tell you what I felt first, because it was not fear. It was a very small, very stupid flare of pleasure. The CEO has messaged me at 11 at night, which lasted about the length of time it took my eyes to reach the second word, at which point every warm thing went out of me at once, and I put my hands flat on the steel because the floor had moved. Vesper Kestrel, 11:06. I cleared those days 2 years ago. I did not understand it. I read it 11 times and I did not understand it once. My brain was still 4 seconds behind, still on the first horror. She has opened it. She has read the doses. She has read the 4 windows. She knows. And the sentence would not fit into that horror because it was not the sentence of a woman who has just found something out. It was the sentence of a woman who was telling me she already knew 2 years ago. I sat down on the floor of the cupping room with my back against the cupboard where we keep the sample tins, in the dark, with the tap still running at the far end, and I did the arithmetic that I had refused to do for 2 years. And it took me under a minute. 2 years ago in June, I had gone down at the table. Not dramatically. It was the second day of a window, and I had told myself I could work through the fade because we were short, and the Assam had landed, and at about 9:10 in the morning, the room went very white and very far away, and I came round on the floor with Ada's coat under my head, and 11 people looking at me, and Vesper Kestrel standing in the doorway with her hand still on the frame, 4 feet away, not coming any closer, her face doing something I had never seen it do. I had told them it was the heat of the room. It was August. Everyone believed me, and the story of Thea Halloran fainting on a hot morning went into the general noise of that building and was gone inside a week. The PM4 blocks had started in the October of that year. She had watched me go down. She had worked out why. And then she had gone into the roster herself, not HR, not the floor manager, herself at night, the way she does everything. And she had put 4 windows a year into the system under a maintenance code, permanently, for a bench, not for a person, so that there would be no line anywhere in any file at that company that said the word Omega next to my name, because she had watched what happened to Marguerite Vaz in 2019 too. For 2 years, she had been protecting me from the one thing that could have taken my bench away, and she had done it in a way that made absolutely certain I would never find out. And she had never once come within 4 feet of me. I sat on that floor until the tap started to run cold, which takes a long time. And then I did something that I would like to tell you was brave, and was actually just the thing you do at midnight when the floor has moved. I typed, "How did you know?" and I deleted it. I typed, "I am sorry, wrong folder, please delete it." And I deleted that too because it was a lie, and I was suddenly and completely finished with lying to that woman. What I sent at 11:41 was 4 words. I said, "You cleared them how?" The reply took 19 minutes. I know because I watched every one of them. She said, "Come to the loft, bring the spoon." The drying loft is the top of number 4, above even the cupping room, and it is the oldest part of the building. Bare brick, a plank floor gone soft and pale from a century of tea dust, and a run of shuttered windows down the west side that they used to open in pairs to pull air through the racks. Nobody dries anything up there now. It is where we keep the old chests and the retired equipment, and the 200 years of paper the company is legally required to keep and morally unwilling to look at. It is also, and I did not know this until that night, where Vesper Kestrel goes when she cannot be in the rest of her own building. She was standing at the far end under the last shutter, in her coat with the light off, and there was a lamp on the floor beside her that she had clearly carried up and then not switched on. She said without turning round, "Don't come past the 3rd window." I stopped at the 3rd window. Of course I did. 8 years of 4 feet does something to you. My body obeyed her before I had decided anything. And then I heard myself say into a dark room to the woman who owned the building, "No." And I walked the rest of it. She turned around. I had never seen her from closer than 4 feet in daylight, and I had certainly never seen her at midnight. And the thing that undid me was not that she looked frightening. It was that she looked exhausted in a way that has taken years, the way a wall looks when the damp has been in it a long time, and that she took 1 step back as I came and hit the shutter and had nowhere else to go. I put my grandmother's spoon down on a chest between us because she had told me to bring it, and I did not yet know why. And I said, "Explain the roster." She did, flatly, in order, with no defense, which I have since learned is what that woman does instead of apologizing. She said, "In August, 2 years ago, you went down at the north bench. You told the floor it was the heat. It was 11 degrees in that room at 9 in the morning, and there were 2 windows open." She said, "I had the medical form Marguerite Vaz filled in 2019 on my desk for a year before they moved her. And I signed the transfer because I was told it was a promotion, and I was 34 and I believed it. And it took me 8 months to work out what had actually been done to her. And by then she had gone." She said, "If I had asked you, you would have had to answer me. And an answer to a director is a record. So I did not ask you." She said, "I put the blocks against the bench, not against you. A bench cannot be reassigned to compliance." I said, "For 2 years." She said, "For 2 years. And I want to be honest about what happened in me, because I think most people would like the story where I am moved." I was not moved. I was furious. It came up out of somewhere very old, and I said things in that loft that I have not entirely forgiven myself for. And the first one was, "You decided." And the second one was, "You looked at me on that floor, and you worked out what my body does, and then you built me a cage with a nice view, and you never once let me know I was in it." She took that without moving. Then she said the only thing she could have said that would have stopped me, which was, "Yes." Not a defense, not the reasons, which were good and which I already knew, and which she never once offered as an excuse in the whole rest of this. Just yes. I have thought about that a great deal since. Vesper Kestrel has never in her life argued with a true sentence, however much it cost her, and I think that is because she was raised by a woman who argued with all of them. So we stood there. And after a while, I asked her the second question, the one I had actually climbed the stairs for. I said, "Why 4 feet?" And that is when she picked up my grandmother's spoon. She turned it over twice in the lamplight, and she ran her thumb along the worn side of the rim, the thin side, the left side, and she said, "Ivy Halloran drew this across her lip about 1,000,000 times." And I said, before I could stop it, "How do you know that?" And Vesper Kestrel said, "Because I am the one who bought it back for you. I need to slow down here." When my grandmother died, I was 17 and there was no money, and there was a debt to a chandler's, and the executor sold the contents of that room over the shop in a lot to a dealer on the quay who sold trade curios to collectors. I found out 4 days too late. I went down there and stood in that shop and asked, and the man told me the tasting set had gone to a private buyer that morning, and I walked home along the water and was sick over the railing. 2 years later, on the first day I ever set foot inside Marrow and Kestrel, in the packing hall, there was a small parcel on the bench with my name on it and no note. The spoon, the dead thermometer, nothing else. I had assumed for 9 years that some kindness had come out of my grandmother's old trade, from one of the men she carried with, and I had asked around, and nobody had ever owned up to it. And I had let it go the way you let a mystery go when the mystery is a good one. Standing in that loft at midnight, I did the second piece of arithmetic of my life, and it took me even less time than the first. I said, "You bought that in the November before I was hired." She said, "Yes." I said, "You bought that before you ever met me." And Vesper Kestrel, who does not lie, and who I had never once seen look away from anything, looked at the floor and said, "I met you in 1999. You were in a room over a chandler's shop, and you were about 4 years old, and you were sitting on the floor in front of a folded towel with 9 cups on it." My mother had sent me down to Ivy Halloran to be taught, because my mother had decided that if I was going to be the 4th Kestrel, I would learn from the best palate on that water. And the best palate on that water was a woman she would not have had in her house. I went twice a week for 2 years. Your grandmother taught me everything I know. And every single time I went, you were on that floor. I sat down on a tea chest. I had to. She said, "She died in 2015. My mother did not let me go to the funeral, because by then we were buying from the same brokers, and it would have looked like sentiment. I went to the key instead and bought her set off a dealer, and I put it in a drawer because I did not know what else to do with it. And then 2 years later, your name came up on a hiring list for the packing hall, and I recognized it. And I put the spoon on a bench because it was yours and it had never been mine. I said, and my voice did a thing I was not proud of. You could have told me. She said, told you what? That I had watched you since you were 4. She said it with an absolutely level face. And then she said the sentence that explained the 4 feet, the 8 years, all of it. She said, there is no version of that I can say out loud that does not sound like a claim I have not earned. Now I am going to skip forward 11 days, because if I tell you everything about those 11 days, we will be here until the harvest. And because the important thing about them is not what happened, but the exact rate at which it happened, which was unbearably slowly, and in public, and mostly in silence. 4 feet became 3. Then it became the width of the cupping table, which is 2 feet 4 inches, and I know because I measured it with a steel rule one lunchtime like a lunatic. She came to the north end of the room. She stood where the light was and let me see her doing it. She started handing me samples directly instead of routing them through Ada, and the first time her fingers came off the tin at the same moment mine went onto it. The whole floor went on working, and nothing at all happened. And I stood there for 4 seconds with a tin of second flush in my hand and a noise going on in my ears like a kettle. And every morning at 5:10, she was already there, listening to the water. On the 4th of those days, I did the thing I had wanted to do for 8 years. I set a cup in front of her. The room noticed. 60 cups on that table, and every taster on the floor found something to look at. Because everyone in that trade knows the story. That cold water does not taste, that she has not put a spoon in her mouth in front of a witness since she was a girl, and the trade tells it as arrogance, and the trade is wrong. And I had worked out why about 3 days earlier, and I had been sitting on it since. Her mother took the clocks out of the room in 1996. She also took something else. Vesper told me later, in the loft, in the flattest voice in the world, I graded a lot wrong in front of 6 buyers when I was 15. She made me stand at the table and say each of my errors out loud. Then she said that palette is not to be trusted in public again until it is worth something. And it never became worth something because she never let me use it. And now it is 38 years old and it has never been used. And I do not know what it is worth. And I have arranged my entire life so that no one will ever find out. The cup. I set it down and I said, loud enough for the room, because I am my grandmother's granddaughter, and she carried chess for 11 years to get to a table. This one has a fault in it, and I cannot find it. I need another mouth, which was a lie. There was no fault. It was the cleanest cup on that table. She looked at me for a long moment, and then Vesper Kestrel picked up a spoon in a room with 9 people in it and took the liquor across her palate, hard, correctly, the way my grandmother taught both of us on the same floor 20-odd years apart, and held it and spat and set the spoon down and said, to me and not to the room, there is nothing wrong with that cup, Halloran. And every person in that room heard her say my surname without the pause in front of it. Priya cornered me in the stairwell that night. Priya has known me since I was 19 and has never once let me have a private thought unexamined. And she said, you know she is going to be sold in 9 days, don't you? And that was the first time anybody said out loud to me what the whole building had been circling since the spring. Ondine Kestrel came to the wharf on the 5th day, which was 3 days earlier than she was expected, which is how that woman travels. She came up to the cupping room at 9:30 in the morning, in pale gray, and she stood at the south end with her hands folded and watched 30 cups get graded without saying a single word, and the room emptied itself around her the way it always does. People finding paperwork, finding a sample to fetch, finding the stairs. By 10, there were 3 of us on that floor. By 5 past, there were 2, because Ada Pike is the only person alive who will stand in a room with her and go on working. And even Ada found a reason to be in the sample store. She waited until I was alone, and then she walked the length of the table and stopped at my bench and looked up, for quite a long time, at my grandmother's cracked thermometer. She said, Ivy Halloran's? And I said, yes. And she said, she was the best palette that ever worked this water, and she died in 2 rooms over a chandler's shop. And I want you to hold both of those facts at once because they are the same fact. I have never been spoken to like that in my life, before or since. There was no cruelty in it at all. That is what made it unbearable. She said it the way a doctor tells you what the scan shows. She said, my daughter has spent 8 years arranging herself around you, and she believes she has been discreet, and she has been about as discreet as a fire in a paper shop. I have watched her do it since the November she bought a dead woman's spoon off a dealer on the quay. She said, I did not put that clause in the deed to be cruel. I put it in to be clear. She is the 4th of us to run this house, and she will be the last one who is allowed to be sentimental about it. And I would rather she paid the price in a year when the price was survivable. And then she said the sentence I have never been able to get entirely out of my ear, which was, I am not asking you to leave her alone, Miss Halloran. I am telling you that whatever you two are being so careful about, the bill for it is already written, and the only choice either of you has is who is standing there when it arrives. Then she went downstairs and had lunch with Corisanda Blythe at a restaurant on the quay, and was photographed doing it, which was, of course, the entire point of coming 3 days early. I did not tell Vesper. I have gone round and round on that, and I still do not know if it was the right thing. What I did instead was go up to the loft that evening and sit on my chest in the dark until she came, which by then she did, every night without either of us ever once arranging it. I asked her about the clocks. It was not what I meant to ask. She stood at the shutter with her flask and she said, there is a clock in every room in this building now. I put them there in the first month after she stepped back. She said, I have never once looked at one. And I said, why keep them? And she said, so that the next person who works here does not have to be raised the way I was raised. And then she said, quietly, to the shutter, it did not work. You cannot unteach a person to count their own pulse. So I made her do it in front of me. I put a kettle on the loft floor, and I made her call it 60, 75, 88, just off the boil, with her thumb nowhere near her wrist, and I checked her against a probe thermometer that cost £9, and she was inside 2 degrees every single time, 11 times running. And on the 11th, she said with something happening at the corner of her mouth that on anybody else would have been a smile, that is not a skill. That is a scar. And I said, it is both. Most things are. That was the 5th day. There were 4 left. And I did not know it, and I would give a great deal to have that evening back with the shutter open. The harvest cupping is the oldest thing that house does. Once a year on the warehouse floor, the year's lots go up unlabeled and blind, and every buyer, broker, and journalist on that coast comes and stands on the boards among the chests and watches the tasters grade in the open. It is 130 years old. It is also, and everybody knows it, a trade fair with a costume on. It is where the year's prices are really set and where a house tells the market what it is. And this year, 11 days out, Ondine Kestrel had put a resolution to the board, the Blythe and Vane structure to be signed on the floor of the harvest cupping, in front of the trade, as a statement of confidence. Corisanda Blythe came to the wharf twice that week. The second time she came alone, up to the cupping room at 4 p.m, and she did the thing that people like her do, which is to be extremely pleasant to the staff in a way designed to be watched by the person who owns them. She stood at my bench. She looked up at my grandmother's cracked thermometer for a while, and then she asked me, with real warmth, whether I had ever considered how much of what I did could be done by a machine, and whether that did not free a person up for something better. And I said no. And she laughed as though I had made a joke, and she said, you are all very charming here. I said, you have used that word twice now. She stopped laughing and looked at me properly for the first time, and I watched her file me somewhere. 2 days later, she filed me somewhere else. Ada found me in the loft on the 7th evening, sitting on the chest I always sat on now, and she had her cap in her hands, which with Ada is a weather warning. She said, you never wondered why the roster was so kind to you, love? And I said, not anymore. And she sat down opposite me on a stack of empty chests and told me about the trust. He should not have known. He knew because he has been foreman of that building for 40 years, and because Ondine Kestrel has never once in her life considered the possibility that the woman moving her chest could read. She had carried boxes of papers up to that loft after the last of the old Kestrels died. She had seen the deed, and she told me, in a brick room at 8 at night, that if Vesper Kestrel bonded with a person her mother had not approved in writing, the voting shares in that company went out of her hands forever. And the house my grandmother had spent 31 years 200 meters from would be signed over to a woman who thought a cupping room was charming. I said, "When was it written?" He said, "The year she turned 30. I said, "What is the approved list?" And Ada Pike, who has never told a lie in the whole of her life, looked at her cap and said, "There is one name on it, love, and she has been sat in your cupping room twice this week." I went home and did not sleep. And at about 4 in the morning, I understood the whole architecture of the last 2 years. And it was so clean and so cruel that I actually laughed out loud in a dark flat. Ondine Kestrel had not written that clause about a stranger. She had written it in the year her daughter turned 30, which was 2 years after her daughter started leaving a brass spoon on a bench in a packing hall for a girl she had watched since she was 4. That woman had seen it. Whatever it was, she had seen it before either of us had, the way mothers like that always do, and she had gone and put a price on it, not to stop it because you cannot stop it, but so that when it finally came, it would cost her daughter everything she had spent her whole life obeying her to protect. The 4 feet was never about me. The 4 feet was the exact distance at which the clause could not be triggered. I got up at 5 and went to work. The letter came on the 9th day, and it did not come from Ondine Kestrel, because that woman has never in her life put her own name on a knife. It came from a compliance firm in the city with a name like a law practice and a logo like a bank, and it was addressed to me at my flat, and it arrived on a Saturday so that I would have 2 days to sit with it before anybody in the building was contactable. They had the audit log. Of course they had the audit log. A migration is a migration precisely because everything that moves is written down. And what the audit log said, in a font designed to make it look inevitable, was that at 23:04 on the 26th of September, an employee had transferred a personal medical document into the chief executive's review folder, and that at 23:06 the chief executive had responded, and that a review of roster records had subsequently identified recurring operational blocks, code PM4, applied to bench NW1 by the chief executive's own credential at 2:14 in the morning on 4 occasions per year for 2 years. It was all true. That is what I could not get past. Every fact in it was true. And every fact in it had been assembled by somebody who understood exactly how a true thing can be made to point the wrong way. The letter said, falsification of operational records. It said, undisclosed personal relationship between an officer and a subordinate. It said the board would be considering the matter, and that in the ordinary course, a matter of this kind would be resolved by the officer's resignation. And then, on the 3rd page, in the paragraph that told me who had actually written it, there was an alternative. The alternative was that I sign a statement. The statement was already drafted, which is the detail I think about most because it means it had been written before anybody asked me anything. It said that I had requested the accommodation. It said that I had asked the chief executive to conceal my medical status from the company's records, that she had done so at my insistence and against her better judgment, and that I now recognize this to have been an error on my part. It said that I would resign with immediate effect and accept a payment described as ex gratia. It said I would not discuss the matter. Sign it, and Vesper Kestrel keeps her company. Refuse, and she goes, and the house goes with her. And Corisande de Blythe puts an instrument on my bench inside 18 months, and my grandmother's thermometer goes in a skip. They had built me a machine with 1 lever on it. I sat in the flat with the pages on the table for about 4 hours. Priya came in at some point, read it standing up in her coat, said one word that I will not repeat, and then sat down opposite me and said the thing that best friends are for, which was, "Thea, they wrote this before they asked you, so they are not frightened of you saying no. They are frightened of you saying it out loud. And I said, I have to sign it. And Priya said, yes, you do. And then she said, but not on a Saturday. I want to be honest about my reasoning because I have heard people be very brave about this since, and they were not in the room. I did not sign it out of love. I signed it out of arithmetic, which is the only thing I have ever been reliably good at. Vesper Kestrel had spent 2 years spending her own credential at 2 a.m. to keep 4 days a year off my record, and had built her entire adult life at a distance of 4 feet from anything she wanted. And she had done all of it inside a clause her mother had written, to make sure that the day she finally reached for something, she would lose the only thing she had ever been allowed to have. If I refused, all of that was for nothing, and the cost of it would land on her, and she would take it without arguing, because I had watched her take a true sentence without arguing in a dark loft, and I knew exactly how she was built. So I signed it on the Sunday night, and I put it in the postbox on the corner at 11:10 in the rain, and I stood there with my hand still in the slot for a good 5 seconds like an idiot. I did not tell her. That was the condition, and also the point. On the Monday, I did not go in. On the Tuesday, a courier came for my white coat and my locker key. On the Wednesday, the head of HR rang and used the phrase mutual and amicable 4 times in 9 minutes. And I could hear a compliance solicitor breathing on the line behind her. Nobody came from the top floor. I sat in the flat and I watched my phone not light up. And I told myself that this was exactly what I had bought, and that I should be pleased with the purchase. And on the Thursday night at about 2 a.m, I got up and stood in my kitchen and cried so hard I had to hold the edge of the sink, which I had not done since my grandmother died. The harvest cupping was on the Saturday. Here is what I did not know that week, and what Ada told me afterwards, standing in the goods door with her cap in her hands. On the Monday morning when I did not come in, Vesper Kestrel came down to the cupping room at 5:10 and stood at the north bench for 11 minutes without saying anything, and then went and found Ada and asked her one question. Did she look frightened when she left? And Ada said, she did not leave, Miss Kestrel. She was got rid of. And then she told her about the letter because she had seen the courier's docket. And because she is 71 and has been waiting 40 years for a reason to interfere. On the Tuesday, Vesper Kestrel went to see her mother. Ada was not in that room, and neither was I. So all I have is what the building heard. And what the building heard was nothing at all, because that family does not shout. What we have instead is the timing. She was in there 50 minutes. She came out and walked the length of the warehouse floor and out onto the wharf, and she stood at the end of it in the wind with no coat on for a long time, exactly the way she had for the Dutch buyer. And Ada, who I love, went and stood next to her and did not say anything either. And after a while she said to the water, I have done this the careful way for 20 years, and it has cost me every single thing I have ever wanted. And Ada Pike, foreman 71, said, then stop being careful, Miss Kestrel. The harvest cupping opens at 11 on the last Saturday of September, and the whole trade comes. They clear the warehouse floor of everything but the chests. They lay the longboards down the middle, and 80 white cups go out in a line under the roof lights with the lids on. Buyers from 4 continents. Every broker on that coast. 3 journalists, one of whom writes the price column that half the market reads on a Monday. And this year, at the end of it, on a table by the freight door, a signing. I was not invited. I had signed a piece of paper 11 days earlier that said I would not discuss the matter, and would not in the ordinary course be on the premises. I went anyway, and I want to tell you it was defiance, and it was not. It was my grandmother. She carried chests off that wharf for 11 years and stood in the doorway of a room she was not allowed into, breathing. And she got in by standing there. I put on the good coat, and I walked down the North Wharf at 10:30 in the morning, and I stood in the goods door of number 4 warehouse, on the outside of it, in the doorway, where the Hallorans have always stood. Ada saw me from 30 feet away. She did not wave. She went and got a chair, an old bentwood thing from the way office, and she carried it across the whole width of that floor in front of 200 people and put it down for me just inside the door, and then she took her cap off to me and went back to work. The cupping ran 2 hours. It is not exciting to watch, and that is the point of it. 80 cups, a line of tasters, the lids coming off in sequence, the spoons going in and out, the brass bowl. Ondine Kestrel stood at the freight door end in pale gray with her hands folded. Corisanda Blythe stood beside her in a beautiful coat with a folder under her arm, and at the north end of the boards, in charcoal, with the whole trade watching her do it, Vesper Kestrel stood at a table she had not tasted at, in front of a witness, since she was 15 years old. At the end of a harvest cupping, the house puts up one last lot. It is 130 years old, that bit, and it is theater, the year's best lot, unlabeled, and the room guesses. And then the house says what it is and what it is asking. That is the price signal. That is the whole reason the trade stands on a cold floor for 2 hours. They brought out the last cup, and Vesper Kestrel said, into a room of 200 people, "Before we grade this one, I'm going to say some things, and the board can do what it likes about it afterwards." I have watched a lot of people be brave since then, and I have not seen anything to touch it. And the reason is that she did it in the flattest voice in the world, with her thumb pressed to the inside of her own wrist, counting. She said, 2 years ago, a member of my staff went down at that bench. She said I worked out why, and I did not ask her, because in this company, an answer becomes a record, and I have seen what this company does with that record. She said, so I blocked 4 windows a year against the bench under a maintenance code, using my own credential at 2 in the morning, so that nothing anywhere would ever say the word Omega next to her name. She said, that was me. It was not requested. She did not know. She has never known. And 11 days ago, she was made to sign a statement saying that she asked me for it, and she signed it. And I know exactly why she signed it, and I am standing here telling 200 witnesses that every word of it is false. Corisanda Blythe said, quite pleasantly, that perhaps this was a matter for the boardroom. And Ondine Kestrel said nothing at all, because she had already understood. And she was looking straight at her daughter with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, which was not anger. It was the look of a woman watching a very long investment fail. Vesper said, there is a clause in the family trust. It says that if I bond with a person my mother has not approved in writing, the voting shares leave me. She said, it was written when I was 30. It was written because my mother had already noticed something I had not admitted to myself, and she wanted to be certain that on the day I stopped being careful, it would cost me the house. Then she said, the house is not the price. The house was never the price. The price was 8 years of standing 4 feet away. And she picked up the last cup, and she looked down the whole cold length of that warehouse floor, past 200 people, to a chair just inside the goods door, and she said, Halloran, come and taste this. I want you to understand what that room was. Every buyer on that coast, the price column, the woman who had come to buy us, and a girl out of packing sitting in a borrowed chair in a doorway with a signed statement of her own worthlessness in a compliance file in the city. I walked the whole length of it. Nobody said one word. The boards are old, and they sound under a heel, and I could hear every step I took. She had the cup in her hand. She did not put it down on the table for me. She held it out, and I had to take it out of her fingers. And that was the first time in 8 years that Vesper Kestrel and I touched on purpose, in front of the entire trade, over a white cup of tea. My hand was not steady. Hers was not either, and I was the only person in that building close enough to see it. I took the liquor across my palate the way my grandmother taught me on a floor in a room over a chandler's shop, hard, at speed, and I held it 4 seconds. And I started laughing, which is not what anybody expected, because I knew that cup. I had known it from 2 feet away before it ever reached my mouth. It was a Nilgiri off a small holding 60 miles from where my grandmother's people had come from, dried too fast on the 2nd day, and rescued on the 3rd by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. And it had come through number 4 in 1996, and again in 2004. And it had been Ivy Halloran's favorite lot in the world, the one she said was the only tea she had ever met that had survived being treated badly and stayed sweet about it. Vesper Kestrel had gone and found it. That is what she had been doing with the 11 days, I said, to the room, in the voice you use for a grade, because that is the only voice I had left. Nilgiri, Blue Mountain Slope, high grown. Rushed on day 2. You can hear it in the top of the roast. It is nearly scorched. Corrected on day 3 by somebody good. And then I said, my grandmother graded this lot on this floor in 1996, and she gave it a 14, and she was wrong, and it is a 15, and she knew it, and she never changed it because she said a woman like her did not get to change her mind in public. And Vesper Kestrel said, change it. I said, it is a 15. She said, then it is a 15, and she turned to the room and said, the last lot grades 15 on the word of Thea Halloran, who is the best palate on this water, who I have watched since she was 4 years old, who I have kept 4 feet away from me for 8 years because my mother put a price on her, and who I am claiming now in front of all of you, so that nobody in this trade can ever again be told a private version of it. Somebody dropped a spoon. I heard it go on the boards. She said, to me, and only to me, in the voice that never rises, say no, and I will stand back, and none of this touches you, and I will still make them tear that statement up. Say no, and I go on exactly as I was. And I said, I have spent 8 years watching you not come any closer. Do not you dare stop now. She put the cup down on the boards. And then Vesper Kestrel closed the 4 feet in front of the trade, the press, her mother, and the woman who had come to buy her, and put her hand flat on the back of my neck the way you do when you are asking, not taking. And I turned my head to the side and gave her the answer without a single word in it. I will not tell you it did not hurt. A claiming bite is not a kiss. It is a decision made in a place where you cannot take it back. And it goes in hot. And the sound I made went across 130 years of floorboards, and every person in that building heard exactly what it was. When she lifted her head, there was blood on her mouth, and she did not wipe it off, which I think was deliberate. And she said to 200 people 5 words, that is a bond mark. Ondine Kestrel walked out through the freight door and did not come back. Corisande de Blythe put her folder back under her arm and stood there for a moment doing arithmetic of her own. And then she came over and shook my hand and said, without any warmth at all, that she looked forward to seeing what the house did next, and left. The signing table went out on a trolley at 2:30 with nothing signed on it. We did not go upstairs for another 2 hours, because there were 80 cups to clear, and a trade to get off the floor, and because neither of us knew how to leave a room together in front of people yet. Ada put the chair back in the way office. Priya cried in the packing hall and denied it for a fortnight. And then at about 5 p.m, in the last of the light, Vesper Kestrel took me up the west stairs to the drawing loft, past the 3rd window, and shut the shutter. And this is where I have to stop, because what happened next was never meant for YouTube. If you want the uncut version, it's waiting on my Patreon. The link is in the description. The trust clause fired. I want to be clear about that, because people always assume it did not. The shares moved on the Monday. Ondine Kestrel took the voting block of Marrow and Kestrel out of her daughter's hands 11 days after the harvest cupping, and it was entirely legal, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. What she had not accounted for, and I have thought about this a great deal, and I think it is because she has never once in her life understood what a trade is, was that the price column ran the whole thing on the Monday morning, not the merger, the grade. Somebody at the north end of that floor had put a 15 on a Nilgiri on the word of a taster. The house had just been made to sack. And the market did what markets do, which is that it believed the palate, and every broker on that coast rang number 4 before lunch, asking who was grading for us next year. You cannot vote a palate. That is the thing my grandmother knew and Ondine Kestrel never learned. You can own a warehouse and a brand and 140 years of paper. But the reason anyone pays you more than the going rate is that somewhere in the building there is a mouth they trust. And mouths do not appear on a share register. Vesper resigned as chief executive on the Wednesday, in writing in 4 lines, and took nothing with her but the flask. On the Friday, she signed a lease on the top 2 floors of a dead-bonded warehouse, 11 doors along the same wharf, which had been empty since 2009 and smelled of pitch and pigeons, and which had on its top floor north windows. We opened as Halloran and Kestrel 8 months later, my name first. I fought her about it for a week and lost, which is the only argument I have ever lost with that woman. because she used the one move I have no answer to, which is that she did not argue. She simply said, Ivy Halloran stood in the doorway of a cupping room for 11 years. Her name goes on the door of mine. Ada Pike came with us. She is 73 now, and she is technically retired, and she is in the building 6 days a week, and God help anyone who mentions it. Priya runs the whole ground floor and 11 people and has opinions about all of them. Marguerite Vaz, who was moved to compliance in 2019 because she wrote one true word on a medical form, blends for us now, and has done since the second year. And the first lot she signed off went out under her own initials on the paper, which she stood and looked at for quite a long time. There is no PM4 code in our roster. There is a line in the staff handbook on the first page that says, cycle leave is paid, it is nobody's business, and no manager may ask you what it is for. Vesper wrote it. It took her about 40 seconds and she has never once mentioned it since, which is how she does everything. I still cannot taste for 4 days, 4 times a year. I never will. It is not a thing that gets fixed, and I have stopped waiting for it to be. What is different is that it is written on the same wall calendar as the shipping dates, in my own handwriting, where anybody can see it, and the world did not end, and no compliance firm in the city has ever had a single thing to say about it. My grandmother's thermometer hangs over the north end of our table. It has not worked since 1974. When people ask, I tell them what she told me. I do not need it to tell me anything. I need it to keep me honest. And then, if they are still listening, I tell them the other half, which she only said once, and which I did not understand until I was 27, and sitting on a floor in the dark with a phone in my hand. Heat leaves a record. It is in everything it ever touched. You can hide it for about 4 seconds. Then the water tells on you. Vesper Kestrel hid it for 8 years, 4 feet at a time at 2 in the morning, under a maintenance code. And then a spreadsheet with the wrong name on it went into the wrong folder at 4 minutes past 11 at night. And 2 minutes later, the water told on her. I have the message still. I have never deleted it, and I am not going to. 6 words, and I did not understand a single one of them at the time. I cleared those days 2 years ago.